Morning, everybody. Looks like we've got a pretty full agenda for the hour. So is Puru here to kick us off with Kubernetes certification? I don't see them in the attendee list. Okay, given that, we'll put that on hold for now. And Daniel, you want to walk us through config maps and CAs?
Daniel is not here either.
Oh,
Different Daniel. This is the Red Hat Daniel, I believe.
Yeah.
it's nice to have enough people at the meetings that we're going to need to start using last names. All right, well, then I think that means Stephen, you're up.
Hey, so a few weeks ago, the Kelly team reached out about tracing. So right now, the way our tracing tag, HTTP tracing tags work for sidecars is that you can just look at the node, and then you can look at what the destination workload is for each request. But that doesn't quite work for waypoints because it shows the waypoint itself rather than the actual destination, and so then you can't get like the nice graphs in Kali. So one thing that they asked for was to include the destination workload in the tracing spans in the tags. So the kind of issue right now is that we can. So this information is exposed through endpoint metadata in Envoy, but it's done in like a somewhat optimized way. So in the format it puts, it's a name, semicolon, namespace, semicolon, this and that. And my idea was, oh, we can just have that as a tag in each span, and then the Kali team can parse that. In the PR that I forgot to link, John was like, oh, well, that's kind of a specific, and we want a more generic API. So we kind of have this fight where we want the specific format, which is a little bit more efficient versus, but somewhat less ergonomic. And I was wondering if we could come to a consensus about what we want.
Okay, John, did you have thoughts on what format you were hoping to see here?
I'll link the PR while John tries to fix his mic.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, so my general thought is that in the tracing output, we need to have something consumable. So internal representations with custom formats and things aren't helpful and aren't standard and are not something we should be doing. The downside is that the current aspects in Envoy that allow you to configure tracing, as far as I know, we have to choose between either tanking the performance of XDS or doing the terrible formatting, neither of which are good options. Further, both options in the current implementation only work in some cases, which maybe it's fine, but there are some limits there. So I actually don't feel like either of these are necessarily the right path to go down, which, to be fair, is basically saying do like 10 times as much work potentially to get this functionality. But at the same time, like, I just don't see, like, this is basically a new feature. I mean, if we step back a bit, I mean, we can pause there if there's questions, but I do want to talk about more broadly, like tracing on waypoints as well, potentially.
Austin?
Well, the problem I have with everything that is Istio specific is, if we are the first one in the universe to have this problem, then maybe we don't have to solve this problem. It's not that important problem. If, as I suspect, other gateways are tracing and they are standards and they are common patterns, I have no problem to implement it, even if they are a bit more expensive. But I would hate to have a tracing that only works for waypoints and nobody else in the world is, because clients, I mean, there is open telemetry, there is all kind of, there is an entire ecosystem around tracing and telemetry, and having something that is unique to Istio is not beneficial to either Istio users or to ecosystem or to anyone in particular. So show me prior art and I'll be happy to support that, but yeah.
Okay.
So, and maybe Steve, you can clarify this. Just to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, the issue isn't the tracing wire format or the like even the data that we show per se. The core issue that I see is Envoy only allowing you to derive tracing attributes from static metadata.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes. And I will also add, I think that our node ID is also a somewhat specific format, and Kelly kind of picks also that. So I guess there is some precedent. I feel like the better solution, which I think is what John's alluding to, is we go and fix it in Envoy. Yeah, so those seem like the three options. All the other I don't. We didn't solve it.
So
I don't think those. Yeah.
this format is how Envoy is sharing traces today in Istio, yes?
No.
No. So how it works is, Bachi, you can explain, Stephen, if you want.
Okay. So I think each endpoint has some sort of dynamic metadata that we use to, sorry, a static metadata that we use to match on. And this format happens to be useful for Kali, that we can expose it. And the kind of problem is right now, since it's static and Envoy doesn't give us like that many knobs, we can't, kind of parse it in Envoy. So kind of to repeat myself, no, we don't expose a tag in this format right now. If I really wanted to expose it right now, it would have to be in this format.
Yeah, then just for context on why we use this format, in Envoy, there's a metadata, which is like a key value pairs, basically. But the way it's encoded is extraordinarily inefficient. And so a long time ago when we did the telemetry v2, we needed these attributes per endpoint to program our stats filter to get this information, like the endpoint destination information. When we did that, we put it as, there's 5 key value pairs here. We put it as 5 key value pairs in the map, and it tripled the size of EDS, which is the most problematic XGS, most frequently pushed thing. So it was tanking the performance of Envoy in the control plane. So what we ended up doing was a compromise, and we shoved it all into one field with separators of semicolons. And then in Istio proxy filter, we split it back out. And that ended up being still very expensive to add. It was like twice the expense instead of 3 times. But that was a compromise for an internal API between the Envoy XDS and our own stats filter. So the difference here would be that this would be talking about putting the same internal format into like our trace, which is kind of our public API.
And this problem really doesn't affect sidecar mode, as I understand it. Is that right?
Correct.
The difference with sidecars and waypoints is that's really the fundamental difference. Is there's different aspects here of what do we include in a trace. In a waypoint, and actually all of Istio, we include the aspects of the actual proxy we're traversing. So in the waypoint, we say something like, hey, this is the waypoint 123 pod. It's in this namespace. It's this service account, whatever fields we include. I don't know the full list. But what we don't include is like, this request is from X and it's going to Y, right? There's actually 3 peers involved in a request to the waypoint: the source, the waypoint, and the destination. We don't include aspects of all 3 of those. In sidecars, you kind of don't necessarily need those because there's only 2 peers involved, and we report at each one themselves. So like on the destination side, the trace is going to say like, hey, I am the HTTP bin service. But on waypoints, it's kind of a different story, which is why I was kind of saying like there's a more broad discussion here around tracing. We had talked about this in the past where the question was really like, do we report the waypoint as the waypoint or as the service the waypoint's acting on behalf of? At the time, what we had decided was and I don't think anyone was super confident in this decision, but that we would report that as the waypoint. So like the primary tag and tracing is called service.name. That's like what shows up as like the primary thing on those tracing UIs and stuff. Like that says waypoint. It's not HTTP bin. The reason we did that is because OTel says that the service name is the actual binary that's running. I think, to be honest, like from a user experience, it's kind of worse because you look at the trace span and it's just like waypoint, 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 waypoint. So it's kind of a, you know, I don't know which one's right. Technically, like the UIs could show things other than service.name, but they don't do that. So.
But John, that's reality. I mean, the tracing is supposed to trace, not to lie about what is happening. So, and if the request is going to a waypoint, the trace should reflect that it went to a waypoint. The problem we have is that zTunnel doesn't trace, as far as I know, even if it could trace. If zTunnel would trace, then it would be absolutely 100% standard and conformant with anything else. Or if the application itself is tracing, will also be reflecting, you know, exactly the standard and no hacker around it. I think, you know, it's now that that zTunnel has some capability. I think zTunnel is tracing. Actually, it has some capability to trace. So it's possible to just be 100% conformant and have the information reflected in the different spans. I mean, the span emitted by zTunnel, by waypoint, and then you can, you know, figure out latency on each point and all the other fine things.
So I actually mostly agree with you. The thing I think would be ideal scenario is, I mean, I said there's 3 peers. Like we could just include spam labels about all of them, right? The thing that kind of sucks is that you can only put one service.name label, and that's what ends up showing up in UIs. If the UIs, like that's a UI limitation, and it would be nice if they, you know, there was another way to say like show this tag in the UI and then we show the service, but you know, that's also something that more mesh specific UIs like maybe Kiali, you know, could improve upon versus generic like Jaeger UI.
Are you sure? Because I've seen plenty of UIs that, you know, work perfectly fine. I mean, if you have a request that goes to 5 different points, you see in the UI, you see each point with a service name where it hit, and it has attributes, and you can stitch them together by trace ID, and they look perfectly fine.
You talking about with waypoints?
I'm talking about any kind of gateways that exist in the world, because we are not, I mean, there are plenty of systems that use, you know, the request goes to 5 different points and, you know, the multiple backends, it forks.
Yeah. So the problem is, like, imagine you don't have span reporting in your applications. You only have Istio doing it, which some people do today with sidecars. Now, the only thing reporting spans is waypoints. So you're going to see the whole tree of all the hops, but each one's going to say waypoint, 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 which becomes kind of less useful.
No, but if zTunnel also reported span on behalf of the application, you'll have spans for everything. And if the application
that's a different story. I want to address that, but I think we should probably let this hand go because it's probably more relevant. But we can come back to that.
Yeah. So all we're trying to do, so reporting from the Kiali side, is, you know, accuracy is great, I guess, when you're talking about tracing, but, you know, from the perspective of the users who are used to using Istio, they're more interested, I think, in seeing their service traffic and tracing as opposed to the infrastructure of Istio itself, right? So with ambient now having the centralized reporting from waypoints, and logging actually is sort of in this area too, it does make it harder for the UIs like Kiali, but also the users to track what's logically happening between their service communication. And, you know, I think when you say accuracy is good, it's true, but it's not necessarily what everyone wants to see. They want the infrastructure to just do its thing, and they want to see what they're actually trying to accomplish. So in Kiali, you know, we did have a regression with part of our functionality because we're trying to do the best that we can given the tracing information that we're now getting coming out of the waypoints. And as John said, you know, if you look at it right at the surface level, all you're going to see is waypoint, 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 waypoint. So we're kind of having to dig a little deeper into the information to try to present a more logical view. the issue that we reported to, specifically has to do with the fact that we can no longer do our graph overlays of tracing. So if anyone's ever done that or seen that, you know, in the graph for Kiali, you can select a trace and then have that trace overlaid on top of your graph, and it's not really possible now. So that's why we were inquiring about a change.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. That's good context. One question I have for you, ignoring like all these implementation details, backwards compatibility, all that stuff. If we just reported, like, here's the source attributes, you know, a workload namespace, whatever. Here's the waypoint attributes. Here's the destination attributes. I assume that would meet your use case, right?
I think so, right? I mean, it's really, and you know, in that way, you actually could get potentially more than we had before, right? Because you could report on the infrastructure, the waypoint, you know, hop, and the actual request, logical request from A to B. So I'm going to say I think so. I'm not. You'll notice I didn't actually submit this issue to Istio. Our expert is a different person in this area. So, but it sounds like the answer would be yes.
Thanks.
Well, then that sounds like we have at least some idea of a path forward. Does this, I'm not quite sure. Stephen, is this answering your question, or are we answering
Can
a
you
different
repeat?
question here?
Can you repeat back what is the step forward? Because I'm not sure we spoke about different things.
I think the proposal was the trace spans would have the source service waypoint information as well as destination service information on them.
But sorry, just to be clear, I wasn't necessarily proposing we do that. We need to look into the technical feasibility of that. I was just trying to make sure I understood whether that would be, like, in my mind, ignoring feasibility, that's the ultimate end goal. I just don't know what compromises we have to make that a reality.
Gotcha.
You mean service, not endpoint. So reflecting the destination service, which is also an URL or.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like everything, right? Like, what aspects do we know about the client? We know its IP address, we know its identity. Maybe from that we derive its name, namespace, all these things. What do we know about ourselves, the waypoint? That we have all sorts of information about ourselves. What do we know about the destination? Maybe it was the service, maybe it was a pod. Like, it's tracing. We can shove a shitload of tags in there, right?
No. There is a standard for tracing. That's my point. I mean, it's service. Yes, it's part of the standard. I believe it's required, and I thought we already do, but the IP and the actual workload identity and other specific things, I don't think they're common. My understanding was that the golden, I mean, the ideal situation would be Z-tunnel tracing as well and being completely, you know, similar with everything else that is tracing at each point in the path.
Costin, can you point us to that standard?
On telemetry?
Oh yeah, OTel semantic convention is probably the thing to look for.
Okay, thank you.
But to be clear, like, it doesn't say what you can't put. It just gives you a list of standardized names. So if we have information, we should use those names. If there's nothing that matches, maybe we make our own. Maybe we try and standardize it.
Yes,
Keith and Louis, do you want to go, or should we talk about Z-tunnel?
Let's talk about Z-tunnel first.
Okay, so Z-tunnel does no tracing today, but in theory, it could do tracing of TCP connections. We actually slightly do this, by the way, internally. We add a trace header to the H-bone layer, and we do log that on the destination Z-tunnel side to do correlation. But this is not the same as application level tracing. Like, these would not have this, they would not be the same trace or have like the shared trace ID. And Envoy doesn't actually propagate these H-bone traces anyway, so it's not super useful. So I don't think that level could ever solve something around this, basically, unless we become an HTTP proxy in Z-tunnel.
Louis, I think you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, I mean, Costin, there's obviously what the spec says, and then there's the physical tracing and the requirements of physical tracing, right? Like, what components did I actually go through? But it's pretty clear that logical is important as well, right? like people, like we do a lot of things where we act on behalf of other systems, right, to achieve a network effect. And if mapping back to the logical world, right, that users were using before they enabled Istio is hard, then we should make that easier for them. Now, we shouldn't do it while violating the standards, but we should augment the information so people who want to provide a logical rendering can do so. I don't think there's any objection to that, right?
My concern is that if we are going, I mean, that was a problem with the original Istio telemetry, which was that only Istio components could participate and we were completely isolated from the rest of the world. You couldn't use a regular gateway. Any other gateway class would not report the same thing and confuse users. With ambient, we are actually, for the first time, we are interoperable and we can swap the gateway implementation. We can swap different things. That will be going back basically to Istio is an island that only talk with Istio component. If you don't have Istio at any point or use any other component, you are good luck. Something will be broken. But yeah, I mean, if we are going back to isolated Istio, then we can do whatever we want. Standards don't matter.
Well, cousin, I don't think that's the choice here, right? Like we can align with standards, and if the standard is what you see in a physical trace, right? But we can always augment the physical with the logical. Right, and if what you're saying is the other third-party components that can be integrated emit physical tracing, right, per whatever the open telemetry spec is, that's fine. You can have a physical rendering of the spec, right? But if like Yali, which are Istio aware, can like make improved visualizations of it, there's no reason not to augment the emitted data.
Let's put it. Let me step back. I mean, I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing with you that we should add more stuff. But if we see other envoy-based implementation using something like that, I'm all for it. My concern is to do something original and unique. Basically, that's my only.
Keith?
So this is a sort of side question to this conversation, because I think this is the right direction to get the conversation. But something that occurs to me is I wonder how much of an issue this would be if the tracing filters could read from filter state, because we have the data in a more like in a clearer format and filter state. I don't know why the tracing functionality in Envoy requires it to be in static, like endpoint metadata. But presumably, if we could read filter state, then all the information that we need should be able to be then put inside the trace in whatever format we would like, without the performance overhead that John alluded to earlier of having to propagate it for all the imports.
Yeah, I think we all agree that if there are standard ways of doing things, we should do them. And I think the big question is, how far do we want to go if we want to go into the Envoy code and change it so that we can expose this in a more standard or ergonomic format, right?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think, like, assuming that we do want to have the logical overlay that Kialisford provides today, then we need performant ways to be able to retrieve that data. I'm just going back to the original sort of dichotomy John presented of either we export this format, which is internal, or we suffer from performance and trying to. I'm just thinking about a third option where maybe what if getting the data into a better, more consumable format is not as performance, doesn't have as many performance issues, essentially. Because it wouldn't be in the XDS, like the actual data wouldn't be in the XDS, it would be in the actual filter state.
How about the middle ground solutions that we do at whatever we're doing for metrics, we also do for tracing?
It's not as simple as that. So the data sources are different for metrics versus tracing. Tracing is more limited.
Yeah, but even ignoring Envoy implementation, if we do that, Costin, then we're not following the OTel
Nothing is
spec, right?
perfect.
So
Again, if we are not to not follow the spec, at least we don't follow it in a consistent way across different. So if we do something for metrics where we don't follow the hotel,
yeah, but there's no spec for this in OTel. There's no spec
I know.
for like this type of thing in OTel and metrics. That's really the problem. And plus, regardless of that, we were conforming to existing Istio metrics. So
Yeah.
Hey, Jay, it's interesting to show us a demo. Personally, I've never used this feature you talk about where you click on somewhere in the graph and then be able to, I think you said show distributed tracing or something.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, if people are interested, I could try to bring this a little from the abstract to the physical, but I don't know if you want to spend more time on this
Yeah,
or
because
not.
we want to see what's the end user impact, right? That I
Sure.
think we were discussing like what is the most desired behavior for the user, and then we can start discussing, how we can support that.
All right, I'll do like a super quick demo. Hopefully you all can see it. So let's see. Can you see the Chiali graph?
Yep.
Yes.
All right, so the first thing I wanted to mention, so here we have ambient with, book info that you guys are probably familiar with. And one thing that we've done in Chiali, right, with ambient is we try to continue to show this logical view, but also let you peek into the physical view of the infrastructure if you're interested in that, right? So what for previous users of Istio Classic or Sidecar, right? They're used to seeing a graph that looks sort of like this. When we talk about getting into the physical, you can see the display option here where we can introduce the waypoint proxy traffic into the graph, right? And you can see how much more complicated the graph becomes even for something pretty simple like this, right? Because you've got your waypoint involved at this point. And it's going to show all of that in and out traffic, even bi-directional traffic going in and out to try to service all these requests.
And that's only for layer 4 because I only see the blue line. Is that right?
Let's see green lines here.
In and out of the waypoint.
Right, because the waypoint is logically or physically, you're talking about Z tunnel going to waypoint and then Z tunnel leaving, right? It's getting directed. So it's kind of abstracted. It seems abstracted, but it's really kind of the way it is. You're not making a request, an HTTP request of the waypoint. You're making an HTTP request, from product page to reviews or product page to ratings or something like that. And so, we do a bunch of things to try to help people understand what's happening. We can even take away all of the ambient traffic, or we can restrict it to like just the waypoint telemetry, in which case, look, now you're seeing all this HTTP. Or you can look at just Z-tunnel traffic. That looks like that. But going back to tracing, get back to what we were talking about. Let me just go back to taking away the waypoints and so forth. Go back to our logical view. So what you could do previously, pre-ambient, right, is if I, for example, selected, this is product page, and I go over to traces, you can get the traces that are involving product page, right? And if I select one, what you used to be able to see would be this complete trace overlay of your traffic that would show you that particular trace on top of your graph. And you could move around and choose different traces to see different paths and so forth. You can see it's broken up. It's not even complete. And this is exactly what's happening, is you get a limitation now because we can't figure this out given what we have. And if you if I was to go over to trace it, so if I just jumped over to the product page detail, basically, And if I go to traces here, you know, here's your scatter plot of all your traces. If I was to select one, go down to span details, this kind of shows what we were talking about with it being waypoint, 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 right? It now looks like all your traces are just going to the waypoint. So we've done a little work to try and show you the operation field, which is actually closer to what the logical view is, right? So even though the traces just look like waypoint, waypoint, what you really see here is that it's the gateway and then product page and then details and so forth, and then reviews. So we're kind of trying to work with what we have. But I wanted to kind of show you the difference between the logical and the infrastructure kind of differences that are true in ambient.
So is it correct in the sidecar case, when you click on one single trace and then back on the graph, it would actually show you like all the trace span that's linked to that single trace. So instead of just seeing one highlighted, you would see like 5
You'd
or
see
6
that whole
hub.
thing, right? So
Okay.
if you wanted to see traces that went through the review service in the old days, and if I clicked on one, you would see a path that was specifically the path for that trace on top of it. The whole thing would be purple, like this edge here you would travel through and you could see exactly what it did. So that, you know, when you look at the graph in Kiali, you're seeing the sum of all parts, right? You're seeing the sum of all traffic, but you don't know specifically what one particular trace path might look like. You know there's traffic between all these services over the period of time that you're looking at, but you don't know what a specific one looks like. And that's why, you could get into a trace and see that one path, and you could see different things. If you wanted to look at the different things that brought you through version 1, version 2, and version 3 of your review service, you could start clicking on traces for each of those different 3 workloads and see what happens, for example. So yeah, Istio Classic, we could do this easily with the traces. Well, not easily, but we could do it.
Is it correct to assume all the traces you have in ambient are the ones that's connected to the gateway? And then it stopped propagating the same trace ID? Or do we generate new trace ID when it travels through the waypoint?
I believe I'm probably not the right person to answer. I think you're not getting the tracing unless you go through the waypoint, right?
That is right. But is the challenging is because I'm looking at your diagram, right? When you enter the request through the book info gateway, I assume Envoy would automatically generate a trace ID for you if it doesn't have one, right? So you do have a trace ID between your gateway to your product page, which is, I think, that what's highlighted right now, right? And then when product page calls review, if you have namespace waypoint, I assume it would hop over to the waypoint, right? In that case, it's the problem that waypoint are not letting the trace ID traverse through the request.
The problem, Lynn, is the traces are fully propagated. Everything's fine. The problem is just whether they have enough labels to give information about the request in a meaningful way that can be exposed to help users and the UIs and whatnot. Okay, got it.
I think I changed my mind on what we discussed. I said earlier a bit. So normally trace is generated by HTTP stacks basically at each point, because it's and what we did, we took this HTTP stack for the application was generating traces. Sidecar, we moved it to waypoint. So if we consider the waypoint as kind of a sidecar that is out of process, it would make sense to generate the same tracing data as if it was in process. And if we have to hack it in one way or another, that's an implementation details that, but if the user is enabling tracing in their own HTTP stack, and pretty much everyone who's doing tracing nowadays, I mean, if they pay for tracing, usually they enable tracing in their applications should probably be not broken by what we are doing, because we are kind of pretending that we are the trace from the application HTTP stack, but the application HTTP stack might generate its own trace. So if we can avoid breaking applications that trace, I think it's fine. I mean, it will be kind of, yeah, they have some stacks that cannot be easily enabled for tracing. We just do it in waypoint logically, and we are 100% consistent, and that's life. I mean, it's if they want more, they can enable it in their application. So
Yeah,
anyway.
but with sidecars, there was 2 traces per request. So are we doing two spans in waypoint?
I
Because
would
we
say
merged a client and a server sidecar into one, right?
Yeah. But it's one is travel into the waypoint, the other one is travel out of the waypoint, right?
so. I would say exactly what we did in Sidecar will be 100% compatible. I mean, whatever we generated before, we generate after.
No, but the
It's not
difference,
possible.
John said, it's one is the source sidecar, the other one is target sidecar reports this, right? In the waypoint, you only have one.
Well,
Oh, I
like
see what you're saying.
hypothetically, you could report 2 spans in waypoint. I'm not sure it's a good idea.
Yeah, probably not a good
I mean,
idea.
maybe
Yeah.
it's a good idea, but it's at least a tricky idea because like you don't know all the source information, right?
But I think
like
that's
in
what
theory,
you-
let me just give an example of one impossible use case. In the telemetry API today, you can put an environment variable into a span. We can't possibly know the environment variable, the source or the destination actually. So maybe we say that's a weird edge case. We don't care about that, but there's other things too. Like, you know, we get a request from someone, we don't necessarily know all the metadata about it to report the span.
I would say that egress gateway would act pretty much generated to. So if you go to workload egress gateway, ingress waypoint, and some other scenarios, it will be similar because we are a
Yeah,
cycle is not
today
an ingress gateway.
waypoint should be, I don't know if it's exactly the same, but I suspect it's the same as an ingress or an egress gateway.
Yep.
Yeah.
So if you use an egress gateway, it will be consistent. If you don't use it, it's just half of it. You get the inbound trace, which is fine.
Okay, I have a stupid question. I meant to ask this question like 30 minutes ago. So in Istio today, if I send a request from my ingress gateway and then to my product page, assuming my product page doesn't have any sidecar, it's not in the mesh, right? Now, if I do distribute tracing, I assume there's only one trace span generated, which is on the ingress gateway, right? So I wouldn't know how much time is spent like from my ingress gateway to the product page. I mean, I might know the round trip time, right, when it travels back to the ingress gateway, but not like the hop to from the gateway to the actual service.
Unless you
Shouldn't your
enable
app?
tracing.
But I would say if your app does tracing, then the trace parent header or whatever the header is should be propagated, and you would get that. I may have missed
Yep.
that part in your setup one.
But who is reporting that if you don't have a sidecar?
The application.
The application itself.
Okay, so your application, so assuming your application have the intelligence to propagate the header, then you might be able to get that data.
So
No, there's a difference between propagating the header and also reporting the span. So the bare minimum is any application should propagate tracing headers because otherwise they totally break
Right,
the
that's why
tracing.
yeah.
But not every application may report it. So if you're using Istio today, you can just say, oh, the sidecar is going to report all my spans anyways, so I'm not going to report an additional span. If you did, you'd get actually more information because you could see the time in Envoy versus the time in the application, which is maybe a cool idea. But for example, like our product page demo, which again, demo, so don't read too much into it, does not report spans to the telemetry backend. It just propagates.
Right.
What John said is very important. I mean, if application enable tracing, and enable tracing is basically just in Java you put some flags in the command line to link some module. In most languages is the same thing. They generate far more information than we generate. So users who pay for tracing usually do that because that's how they get value out of tracing, by generating application specific data.
But you have to rebuild your Docker image, am I right?
No. Well, there's some
Because
ways
you
to do it
drag the
without.
tracing library and then you might have to rebuild the image.
There are all kind of
Assuming you don't
automation
have
around
it. Right,
If
assuming
you
you don't
don't
have
have
it
it
implemented to begin with. Yeah.
Okay.
Like
yeah.
I think Tostin's point is, like in the previous job I had, like we had our own internal tracing Go library. Like if you're going to pay Datadog, Dynatrace, whatever, you're typically going to have your application emit some sort of telemetry. And so like, I don't think anybody's saying that Istio is going to break that. If it follows the spec, that follows the spec, everything gets propagated. It's up to the user whether or not to report that telemetry or not.
Okay, that makes sense. But I guess the value of the mesh is we can't expect the user would do that, right? I mean, if they do that, that's fine. They'll get additional tracing, but we can't assume because that's why they use a service mesh.
But you cannot assume the user needs tracing, and if they pay for tracing, it's reasonable to assume that they, take advantage of it, of what they pay for. I mean, it's not. I cannot imagine a customer paying for tracing and then not enabling tracing in their application. It's kind of weird.
We're not requiring that. We're just saying that's going to be a common use case. Yes?
I suspect so. I mean, it will be very weird to pay money for something that you don't enable.
Well, it's not in any of the example we're showing is Istio.io. Let me put that way, right? 'Cause what we are showing is, okay, user, you don't have to worry about tracing. Through service mesh, we can tell you the hop to hop, how much time I spend. You get it magically.
But I don't think it's possible.
They need to pay for it. So they need to worry about the bill anyway.
I mean, for data, yes, and maybe network bandwidth, but that's assumed, right? I mean, they only need to enable it when they need to debug in something. It's not like they have to have it constant running. So back to the problem we have, though, I think, John, you mentioned about 2 trace span and 1 trace span from the waypoint, but I'm thinking there's only 1 span, right? That span is reporting the time spent when the requests come into the waypoint to the product page or product page to the review, and then from the request that gets back.
Yeah, there's only 1 span. I was just responding to a suggestion someone had to report the same span as sidecar, which would imply doing 2 spans. But I think we agreed that we don't want to go down that route. So
Okay, yeah, because it would be very confusing if we report it as 2.
So I guess the initial question was, do we report the destination workload in kind of a weird way? Do we slow down EDS a bunch and make it a more ergonomic way, or do we not want either and try to make a change in upstream Envoy to make it a little nicer? I'm guessing the only 2 real options are either expose it in the kind of ugly semicolon way, or just to go into Envoy and see if we can get it to have access to better data formats. Does anybody have strong opinions on either?
yeah, I would rather we don't do the ugly formatting.
Okay.
Yeah, especially if we were to go that route, I would want to have feedback from the Envoy project that this was like totally infeasible. This is a new API, effectively, and so we want to make sure we're getting it right the first time.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, that took I'm sorry for anybody else who had stuff they wanted to go over this meeting.
No, that was a good discussion.
Yeah, good education for some of us too.
Okay, I think that's it for me, and maybe we have 10 more minutes left, so hopefully we can get through some other stuff.
All right, next up, actually, you know what, Jay, I'm going to jump over you because I see we've got release manager conversation here that I want to make sure we get to. Mike, you've got the next item there.
Oh, nothing big to discuss. Just wanted to give an update that RC1 has been published for 125. Long-running tests are in progress, and once those complete, we'll move on to publishing.
Thanks, Mike.
Awesome, and nice job. Is there anything that is needing help or blockers? Are the release notes looking good?
Release notes are looking good, I believe. Facilla has a PR pending for that. I believe Craig has taken a look through that so far. I'll take another look through there today, but I think that that's the biggest thing. It's just coordinating around that.
Okay. Do we know on the day of the release there's a step to do the actual publishing of the docs, which has historically been a terrible process that Eric did and then I took over?
Oh no.
Uh,
I think I was under the impression that Craig was able to do that.
It needs
It's
somebody with
plausible
admin.
he could. Yeah, the whole process is I think there's no fundamental reason it needs someone with admin, but for whatever reason we're like pushing directly to the master branch, which makes no sense. So we should just figure out what we're gonna do for 125 and then what we're gonna do for 126 as well.
Cool. That sounds good. We'll make sure to figure out what is needed for that during that process then.
Yeah, I really not like the process even on regardless of requiring one single admin, because it's like you just run this opaque script and it's like, give me your GitHub password and I'm just going to push blindly to all these branches directly.
Oh god.
It's like very sketchy. So
Okay.
would love to improve that aside from the dependency on an admin anyways.
Cool. Yeah, we can take a look through there then.
All right. Anything else on 125 release?
Not for me.
Well, thank you to everyone involved in that. Jewe, do you want to talk to us about this backport request? Oh, you know, Jewe is not in the room. Well, I can give a little bit of context to this because Jewe is on my team. Jewe has added some logic, I think, in both the Z-tunnel as well as in CNI, or maybe it was CA, to add headers to our XDS or all of our control plane requests, the same way that Envoy XDS includes headers about its version and revision information. We're just adding the same to Z-tunnel and CA, basically to all control plane, data plane interactions. That's already been merged into master, but there's some interest in having this backported to 125.1. I'm not sure I can make the case for precisely why he wanted to see this backported. It is a pretty small change. Wanted to check with folks on how they felt about this.
And as the 125 release manager, I talked with Zue and basically suggested that because this is not strictly something that's a bug fix, it probably does fall under the category of like post code freeze, should probably get TOC approval of some sort to approve backporting.
Yeah, what's the impact for the user? I didn't fully understand. Is it to support some customer CA or something?
Nope, the impact to the user is nil. This feature is disabled by default, but it simply adds version headers to the control plane requests. So if a user were to enable it, unless they were inspecting control plane requests into Istio, they're not going to notice any difference.
But what benefit do they gain?
The benefit is for out of cluster control planes. You can route requests by the revision or version of that the data plane is expecting. This is something that we used at Google back in the day, but as the project has evolved, we've not included the same level of header detail in Z-tunnel and some of the other resources. This is also something I think we had support for in our public charts back in the day. I haven't dug through the history to see exactly what happened to that. We have like partial support for it today. We have the Istio chart has an external Istio flag, which basically says, don't actually install Istio, assume Istio is out of cluster, install all the things that need to be in this cluster for the out of cluster Istio to be able to access it. So this is just sort of in keeping with that option.
Some historical context here, Mitch, is that the existing option is for adding XGS headers to Envoy, which was added by a certain managed SaaS control plane offering. They didn't add it for CAs because they didn't use a CA that needed it. So what's been added is adding it to CAs and adding it to Z-tunnel.
Yeah. So it really is just making it consistent.
I mean, there is some logging benefit in the control plane, right? Reporting the versions of the data planes that it's seeing.
We already have all that, Louis. So we have like a ton of info in the actual discovery request. What this is doing is putting some
Oh,
info
it's putting it
in the actual
in the
HTTP
HTTP
headers so that your
Yeah.
load balancer can do, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So this is for SaaS things, right, Mitch?
Yeah, it's for out of cluster control plane is what
Yeah.
it's designed for. We also, like I said, we have partial support for that in the charts today. I think we will likely be contributing additional support for that in the charts over the coming months.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
mean,
have
I've no.
I don't really have
sorry,
an
go ahead, Dave.
objection.
Yeah, I don't have a
I was
strong
just-
objection either. Obviously, I approved on master. The change makes sense. It is really like a feature. You probably, if you're a managed SaaS control plane offering, you probably want to have a way to patch Istio outside of open source patches. But that being said, it's super low risk, so I don't really have any strong desire to not do it.
Okay. Well, thank you.
But if you're doing this because it's the only way you could possibly get this change into a hypothetical managed SaaS control plane offering, like you might consider whether you find other avenues for future changes, given that at some point they will come up.
Yeah. I'll say that we have a strong preference for trying to do as much as possible through the open source project when that is practical and accepted upstream.
Yeah, no, for my context, like we obviously have the same custom builds. What we generally try to do is put everything in the master branch, but then backports generally internally. If they're not things that are, generally backportable. In this case, it's not a big deal because it's so small and low risk, but just something to think about if you guys don't have a strategy planned around that. So.
Thanks. That makes sense.
Sounds good. And I'm not going to do this for 125.0, given that we're so close to publishing that. I'll tag this for 125.1.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Well, that's the end of the agenda and the end of the hour. So that's kind of perfect. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye,
folks.
y'all.